Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today's presentation. We are now live, and I will hand it over to Jerry Cobb to kick us off. Jerry?
Thanks, Sis Chanel. Hi, I'm Jerry Cobb. I am Director of the Pritzker Children's Initiative, and so pleased to welcome you today to this webinar on embedding equity-focused family and parent leadership. This is the first in what I hope will be a series of webinars with our wonderful partner, the National Center for Family and Parent Leadership. We're so excited to be working with them. They're an initiative of the Early Childhood Investment Corporation and have so much to share, over 2 decades of experience around family and parent leadership. And this webinar today is an example of the great work that they're doing to support states and communities and really embedding family and parent leadership into all the work that they're doing. So we're excited about what we'll learn today. Before we go into the presentations, I want to give you a heads up that this webinar is being recorded, and we'll be sharing the recording and presentation after the call. So there will be a time for questions following all the presentations. So please share them in the Ask a Question chat feature, and we'll try and incorporate them as well as we go along. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Natalia Carvalho Pinto, Director of Equity and Leadership at the Early Childhood Investment Corporation, and she will be serving as the moderator today. Natalia?
Thank you so much, Jerry, and welcome everybody, and thank you for taking time of your busy days to be with us today. Interpretation in Spanish will be available for this session momentarily, and directions on how to access that are available to you on the chat. Bienvenidos a todos y muchas gracias por acompañarnos hoy. El servicio de interpretación en español estará disponible, hoy durante este webinar y pueden encontrar las instrucciones y cómo usarlo en el chat. But again, as Jerry said, my name is Natalia, and I serve as Director for Equity and Leadership at the Early Childhood Investment Corporation, where we're working to launch the National Center for Family and Parent Leadership, a new initiative made possible with the incredible support of our friends at the Pritzker Children's Initiative. And our main goal at the National Center for Family and Parent Leadership is to build the awareness, knowledge, understanding, and skills of early childhood systems on how to embed equity-focused family and parent leadership as their way of operating. So today's roundtable conversation will focus on how to center and be intentional about equity when bringing parents to the table to authentically advise, collaborate, and co-lead efforts. When working effectively to engage family and parent leaders into your system's work, there are so many details that we have to think about, and I know that that can also be overwhelming. But today we're not going to cover every detail. Instead, because we are talking about building equitable practices for family and parent leadership, we wanted to start by giving you a lens through which you can approach your work in equitable ways. Most of the wonderful people I have met in this field genuinely want to be more inclusive and welcoming to the families and communities they serve. However, the operationalizing of inclusive efforts requires that you actively look at everything you do through that lens of equity and that framework. So we called Dr. Francisco Villegas today to share his work at the local county government as an effective lens into thinking through and doing equitable work. This is not the only equity framework available out there, but it is a simple yet effective equity framework that has been proven useful in the context of local government, and that anyone here is encouraged to borrow and apply to the core practices that I know many of you are already working to develop around family and parent leadership. We will then ask our parent leaders on the panel, Jacob and Chandra, to provide examples of how they've seen that framework operationalized in different family and parent leaderships and spaces that they've been a part of. And because this work is and should always be centered in community, we are going to do this as a roundtable discussion, right, with these three incredible humans whose life, work, and values center justice, equity, and community. Their full bios are linked in the chat, along with the resources you'll be receiving after this session today. But to get their voices in the room, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves, including their role, and then in one sentence, tell us why do each one of you believe it's important to include families in the work of changing systems? So Chandra, can we start with you?
Good afternoon. I am Chandra Jones, parent leader and owner of the Parent Engagement Group. And families know where there is decreased or denied access. They recognize precisely where barriers exist and can identify where inequitable practices compromise safety.
Okay, thank you. Jacob?
Yes, greetings everyone. My name is Jacob Mabry Penny Johnson. Like Natalia said, I get to work with her at ECIC and on the National Center for Family and Parent Leadership. I'm a father of two, and parent leadership is important for many reasons. It's hard to just pick one, but in short, we as parent leaders hold the keys to help programs and systems operate more effectively and have a greater quality of impact on parents and families.
Thank you. Dr. Villegas.
Hola, buenas tardes. Bueno, no sé qué hora sea con ustedes, pero es la tarde aquí. Thank you for having me today. My name is Francisco Villegas, and I am the Arca Center for Social Justice Leadership Associate Professor of Sociology at Kalamazoo College. I think of families as the ideal location to consider the value of our work. I'm thinking of them as the foundational space to measure the impact of our initiatives and the possible changes that may lead to the best possible outcomes.
Thank you, all three of you, for being here today. So for the next 45 minutes or so, I'm going to ask each of our roundtable panelists a few questions that describe their work in hopes to provide you with a few concrete examples of the ways equity and community and family-centered approaches can be planned and operationalized. We'll also talk briefly about the 5 guiding practices for embedding equity-focused family and parent leadership that inform our work at the National Center for Family and Parent Leadership. But a deeper overview of these practices is linked in the chat for you and will also be emailed to everyone here. Throughout the webinar, we'll also use the words family and parents interchangeably. We recognize that families take many forms, and when we use the word parent, it means anyone in a caregiving role. So our time today is tight, and we have a lot to cover because, let's face it, this work is not simple. So we'll plan on taking maybe 1 or 2 questions max from the audience at the end of the presentation today, if there's time. However, I want to ask you that you please still put your questions in the chat because we're going to collect some of these questions that don't get answered today and plan to send out a follow-up FAQ that will be built based on your questions, right? And we'll send that out to all participants after the webinar. The chat is also a great space for you all to build connections with each other and check in. But I'm going to get started. And to frame our discussion, I'm going to start with Dr. Francisco Villegas. Now, Dr. Villegas, you are a professor of sociology and anthropology at Kalamazoo College. But you also worked on the County ID project in Kalamazoo County, Michigan. From what I understand, this is a program that launched in April of 2018 as a result of a year of organizing by local leaders who recognized the impact of living without access to an ID in Michigan. This was a successful project that brought meaningful, equitable change to services at a local government office, which again is, I think, a great example of how to operationalize our equitable lens, right, to do this work. I know that even though you have done some work in ECE and with ECE researchers, your focus is much broader. and connected across diverse aspects of policy, community, and higher education. So I'm really grateful for you being here, because I think it's important to sometimes look outside our fields, but to similar bureaucratic spaces, to find these successful examples that we can bring back to our own work and our own field as we work to grow, right, and be better. So that's why I wanted to talk about this particular County ID program and this great framework that's been developed as a result and as part of that project. So could you please start by telling us how you became an advocate for the County ID project, specifically how that became part of your advocacy, and especially what you saw as your role and the role you needed to play as a systems expert in working with the local community?
Yeah, of course. But first, please call me Francisco. It's how I introduce myself in the community. As Natalia said, my work has to do with the way that policies affect undocumented migrants. This work really initiated in Toronto, and there I was focused on the idea of access, specifically what it means to proclaim to have an accessible policy. I argued that something is not accessible just because an institution claims it, but instead it must be approached from the standpoint of the people who experience the most barriers in engaging. I wanted policymakers to think about how their own lives could not be the only source of information about what constitutes access, and that the word access means so much more than just the ability to attend or enroll. And so my trajectory then took me to Kalamazoo, where I was invited to attend a meeting about local endeavors to support migrants in the community. And that's where I first learned about the Kalamazoo County ID. I talked to local leaders about the project and asked if there might be a way to support them. I began working with them in a small subcommittee because, of course, they were rightfully wary of my presence. We are often wary of the presence of not just people who are not from the community, but often of researchers who can parachute into communities. I think after some time of developing trust and rapport, I was asked to then support in imagining and creating an ID that would be useful to the community. In doing this work, I then started thinking about what were perhaps some of the elements that would be necessary to support an equitable policy or intervention.
I love this, and the way you describe how the efforts for this project were completely grounded in community and centered through co-leadership with the individuals who are most impacted. So following the success of the ID, you wrote and presented a paper that describes the framework you used to ensure that this change that you were bringing to the county office was equitable, inclusive, and reflective of the perspectives of those who were going to use and benefit most from the service. In our conversations, you called this an equitable intervention, which meant a change of policies and practices supported by equitable considerations. It's such an interesting framework that I find very helpful to anyone at any system and institution who's trying to ground their work in equity, to trying to ground their actual practices in equity. So could you please spend a couple minutes just describing this framework for us as a tool that we can use in thinking about building work that is just and authentically inclusive to the people we serve?
Yeah. So academics love using imagery to visualize complex ideas. And I also recognize that academics tend to love the sound of their own voice. So I will try to be brief. I think to me, it's a lot easier to have a shared visual image to think about how something might function. So in the conference paper where my colleague Kyle Teixeira and I introduced this idea, we discussed it as 3 pillars fundamental to the production of policy supporting undocumented migrants. And this, to me, served as a theoretical grounding to advance a much larger argument. But the more I thought about it, that image doesn't automatically allow us to think about what sits upon these pillars. What are they supporting? And so today I'm proposing that we borrow the image of the 3-legged stool, as you can see on the slide. And so today what I'm really hoping to do is to describe the legs of this stool, how it supports an equitable intervention, and the way that we have employed this idea to create an ID program that we want to be as inclusive as possible. And in doing so, taking into account the specific vulnerabilities of members of our community. including undocumented migrants, but not exclusively. So as you can see, the three legs of the stool are accessibility, utility, and safety. And of course, these legs may seem quite basic and they may appear as common sense, but it's surprising how seldom they are considered and how policy is quite often written from the perspective of the unaffected. Or put another way, how so often the people who stand to benefit from an intervention are not included or centered in the considerations necessary for policy to serve the intended purpose. So the image is inviting us to think about the seat of the stool as the equitable intervention. In that sense, the three legs are fundamental supports for the seat to remain upright. In the absence of one, or the presence of a limitation on one leg, that is, if one leg is missing or one is shorter or longer than the others, it'll be very difficult, if not impossible, to uphold the seat. And at this moment, please let me be clear. I am indeed arguing that in the absence of one of these legs, the intervention, at least as it relates to undocumented migrants, will be rendered completely useless. The legs are not negotiable, and they are to be considered as the very foundation of a possible intervention. Now, if we are to think of the 5 practices of embedding equity-focused family and parent leadership that I know your center has been creating, if we imagine them as the essential components of an equitable intervention, I ask you to think of them as the seat of the stool, and as such, having those 3 legs as the necessary supports. But what exactly are the legs? As I mentioned earlier, accessibility must constitute more than the availability of eligibility or enrollment. I'm thinking about access as the removal of barriers and the production of a welcoming space. In relation to barriers, I propose that we think of at least 3 forms: the physical, the procedural, and the material. The physical includes not only the layout of the space, and that is a question, can people with diverse physical abilities make use of it? Is it in a space, in a location that people can easily reach? But in relation then to the procedural, I'm referring to the process to receive a service and whether it is too onerous, whether it is available in various languages, and how many trips it may take to subscribe or enroll in this process. That is it too difficult for people to be able to access it? Finally, in relation to the material, we as a committee, in thinking about the county ID, had to think about the cost of the card. We had to consider, would we be charging more money for this card than, say, for the state ID? Would we be charging the same amount? And luckily, we were able to find external funds to be able to produce a scholarship service so that people could get the card free of charge. So in this sense, access is about asking where, when, and on whose terms do we come together. It's about asking who constructs the agenda and what are the procedures of engagement. Can we please move to safety? As you might imagine, undocumented migrants experience significant precarity from and caused by the state. In relation to everyday activities, they must worry about the fact that every single person can act as an immigration agent. That is, anyone can pick up the phone and call immigration on them for any reason. So in a project that recognized the value of all residents of the county, we needed to develop a process that would not place people at risk. As a result, safety was a fundamental component to developing a government program aiming to support the community. And we took up safety in 2 ways. First, in thinking about the process of the process of information gathering as it relates to document verification, as well as the storage of data. And secondly, safety as it relates to physical space, particularly the location of the county ID office, but also the idea that other people might be close enough to overhear the kinds of conversations that would out somebody or somebody's immigration status. The third leg is utility. From the onset, we recognized that the value of an ID was inherently linked to its acceptance in the community. After all, What would be the point of having an ID if it was constantly turned away? So in this sense, I would like us to think about utility as two things. One, how useful is this intervention to the community, and does it work as advertised or expected? There is something very useful in in constantly asking whether the work that we do continues to serve a purpose and how we might revisit what we've done to possibly reimagine that intervention. For instance, at one point, we had parents come to us and ask us to change the age under which children could get the ID. Because parents recognized that their children, while they had access to a school ID, it did not have one of the features of the county ID. That is the presence of emergency contact information. And parents thought that this would be quite useful, particularly for children who might use public transportation to get to and from school. So to me, this serves as a very quick example of the value of considering reassessment as a valuable tool to reach the kind of utility that we had imagined for this endeavor. Now, I recognize that I've been going quite fast and that I haven't given you as many examples. And this really is due to the short amount of time that we have to spend together. However, if you're interested, I invite you to read the reports that we developed for the county, as each of them utilize these legs to construct an analysis as well as subsequent action. And Natalia is sharing the citations for them. Mm-hmm. Finally, I recognize that the terms that I have presented thus far are capacious, and that they ask us that we consider them in the broadest context. That is, each term can cover so much ground, it can mean so many things. But rather than us being frustrated by that fact, I want us to think of that as a positive. I would like for us to think of it as a space for possibility. And that is because our lives, and specifically those of our community members, are not simple. And trying to fit them into carefully curated boxes can cause us to miss a whole lot of people. This is particularly important because somehow institutions keep, and I'm using huge scare quotes, they keep forgetting about particular peoples. And here I'm thinking about racialized peoples, poor people, people with disability, queer and trans communities, as well as those who are undocumented, unhoused, or under state supervision. And that's just to name a few. But because of these breadth of experiences, the theories that we employ must also then facilitate the greatest amount of flexibility in order to invite all community members into the space of creating change. You know, I always tell my students that I would make a terrible politician. And that is because I hate the word compromise. And I understand how the word compromise is quite valuable in interpersonal relationships. But here I'm really thinking about the production of policy and how the word compromise gets thrown around quite often. Because while most people begin this conversation by asking what is compromise, I invite us to think about who is being compromised. Who are we asking to take a back seat? Who are we asking to remain unseen? Instead, I would like for us to think about how we might deal with the whole picture and the breadth of experiences it contains. Otherwise, we risk replicating the mistakes that landed us here in the first place. I know I said I wasn't going to talk all that much. I apologize. I've been talking for way too long now. And I want us to save some time to have Jacob and Chandra speak about how they see this particular framework playing out in their experiences in the field of early childhood. So thank you for your time, and I'll turn it back to Natalia.
All right. Thank you so much. And what a great explanation of how to think, right, through that equity lens. So thank you. And I want to circle back to this slide that Francisco briefly presented in thinking about our practices for embedding equity-focused family and parent leadership as an equitable intervention. So if you Google best practices for family and parent leadership, you can definitely find many tips, tools, and resources that have been used over the years, several years, by so many, by so many early childhood systems folks doing great work around family and parent leadership. Here at the National Center, we promote these five practices that systems can use for embedding family and parent leadership. These five practices are grounded in the work that has been developed for family and parent leadership throughout several decades. But this framework that Francisco described also ensures that everything you put into place is considerate of those most impacted, and that you are making the equitable considerations needed for your family and parent leadership efforts. So, in short, unless these five practices that you see here on the slide for embedding family and parent leadership are held up by carefully thought out considerations of accessibility, safety, and utility, they're not equitable. And I know that the word equity gets thrown around a lot by many people within systems without the full understanding that the work of equity is the work of intervening with the status quo, of changing the ways we normally operate, and think through implementation and barriers to authentic participation. Though some of these practices might be very familiar to many of you, what makes them an intervention towards equity and justice is the fact that we must carefully and intentionally consider what access, safety, and utility looks like for our parent leaders and the families we ultimately want to bring to the table. So, and we don't have time to talk about all five of these practices today. However, you can learn more about them and the work of the National Center for Family and Parent Leadership through the handout provided or by reaching out to us after today. But what I want to spend the remaining of our time together doing is speaking briefly a little bit about practice one, which speaks to the need to build buy-in and shared understanding around the system changes needed to embedded family and parent leadership in an equitable way. And then Jacob and Chandra, our parent leaders here, and I will spend a little more time diving deeper into our practice two, which invites you to assess and improve your internal structures, stable practices and dynamics, and your funding mechanisms so that you can bring parents in to advise, collaborate, and co-lead with you. Our hope is that if you're just starting in this work, you'll begin by talking and thinking about equity, or, and each table leg, as Francisco described, and what it looks like when that lens is applied authentically to your parent and family leadership practices. So I'm going to turn the conversation over to Jacob and Chandra, starting with you, Jacob, to talk a little bit about the fatherhood network that you were part of the development of it, and which I understand was founded within Kalamazoo County's Health and Community Service Department, Maternal and Child Health Unit, and it's still growing strong today. But can you please, in thinking about buy-in, can you please tell us why a fatherhood network was needed and a couple of the key steps that you and your co-founders took to build support for this work?
Yeah, thanks, Natalia and Dr. Francisco. So I'll just start with saying, I won't try to take up too much time, that I am the son of a Vietnam veteran and a civil rights activist father. So this idea of like, how has the social political climate affected families has been present for me through my father for a long time. Having experience working in the early childhood field and being a parent leader, I'm just clear that our families, communities, and our early childhood system are better when we support the health and wellness of fathers. Data shows that when fathers are engaged, childhood outcomes are better, whether it's infant mortality, educational outcomes, and some. And we know that oftentimes our dominant cultural narrative around fathers is unengaged, unknowledgeable, when it comes to ages and stages, pregnancy, parent leadership, or just child growth and development. And so the Fatherhood Network here in Kalamazoo, Michigan, started as a grassroots group of men and fathers who looked to combat that narrative, and also realized that we had a lacking in our local community around intentional programs towards fathers. Being a new parent myself, I had experienced home visiting services and was aware that we had multiple great programs geared towards mothers and children, and that we needed the same for fathers. And so through our grassroots group of men and fathers, we were able to kind of utilize our network here in town, which included connecting with local city and county commissioners to kind of bring them on as advocates, to connect more intentionally with our maternal and child health unit of our county's Health and Community Service Department, specifically Healthy Babies, Healthy Start, who helped us kind of develop this idea around a fatherhood program. And then also our local United Way, which we strategically kind of used as a meeting space. And so having these kind of partners helped us establish a fatherhood program at the county, where I myself was employed for a few as well. And so the combination between kind of grassroots efforts, institutional buy-in by way of commissioners, and some local foundations really helped us get our fatherhood program off the ground.
Thank you, Jacob. Now, Chandra, you have told me before about your experiences serving in the Michigan Parent Leadership in-state government advisory board. And you're one of the first parent members of that board, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, and you told me that even though initially only 4 parents were part of this board, it's now made up of 51% parents out of about 20 to 25 folks. So can you tell us how you and other members built buy-in to have a 51% or majority, parent board? What were some of the steps and considerations involved?
Sure. A white paper was written which recommended that a cross-agency steering advisory committee be established that included 50% parents. State departments agreed upon the funding and an advisory was formed. Operating guidelines were developed collaboratively with parents and staff, stated that 51% of the members had to be parents out of the 15 to 5 board members. And so a search began for additional board members from the current planning members that included parents and staff. And so suggestions were made by parents and staff, and based upon the concentration of the population, including rural and urban, and consideration of parents that are using services, not just education, but social services and mental health, etc. Parents were recruited and offered the opportunity to be a board member. And natural attrition occurred with parent and staff members. However, a good number continue until they age out, because parents can remain on the board until their child turns 19. And subsequent members complete an application to be a board member and have been primarily recruited from the training alumni. That is, parents that have gone through the Parents Partnering for Change leadership training.
Okay. So that's kind of, I love your building of buy-in efforts, right? I really like that both of you talked about the needs, right, or the utility of embedding the equitable effort you're trying to build. The efforts you described talked about access and making sure the table was representative of everyone who was impacted. Like Chandra talked about thinking of who was there, right? And representation from rural, urban communities. And making sure that these folks could get to the table. But most importantly, both of you talked about that, explicitly engaging other key players in your work. Jacob, you mentioned how building buy-in takes networks, which involves community grounding, right? It requires community grounding and advocates in the system to write that white paper, as Chandra talked about, or as Jacob described, to push forward the initiative under the county. So thank you for such great examples. However, once you build buy-in for your efforts to bring families to the table, you will need to assess and improve your internal structures, policies, practices, and funding mechanisms to make sure your efforts work. and work in a way that is equitable to everybody you're bringing on. So I'm going to continue the conversation with Chandra and Jacob to provide us a few examples of how the application of accessibility, safety, and utility considerations for family and parent leadership can bring equity and authentic inclusion into your efforts, particularly in thinking about your internal structures, which is our practice too at the National Center. So let's start with Jacob again, and the application of accessibility. But specifically, are you asking yourself, do the parents that you want to collaborate with even have access to the table? So in thinking of that, Jacob, what are like the top 3 things you have actually done and seen done in the spaces you've been a part of? I'm thinking of Fatherhood Network or other spaces, but to increase access for parents to be able to participate in your efforts, the efforts that you fought to put in place.
Yeah, thanks, Natalia. Great question again. I think starting off, and it's probably not new information to folks who are in the social service field, but really just starting with getting rid of the idea of like, if we build it, they will come. And that really we need to go to parents and families and fathers. And so the Fatherhood Network realized that having multiple meeting spaces was a need for us. Of course, that's addressing like transportation barriers. We know that some families and fathers need support there. So offering gas cards and rides when we can. But we also noticed that there was like a cultural trust factor around meeting spaces and location. And so that's another thing that I think we need to keep in mind, that parents and families are showing up with lived experiences that may not always be positive when we're inviting them to new spaces to help share their opinion and expertise. Definitely removing barriers and compensating parents for their time is something that we like to lead with, just understanding that if we want parents to come to our meeting and they're potentially taking off work or putting other obligations aside, that we want to honor that and compensate them for that. And so offering reimbursements and stipends for those who participate, and now also offering childcare is something that we've done. And again, it seems like kind of no-brainers, but this piece around culture and trust, I think, is huge. And so this idea of going to parents or hosting multiple meeting locations, I think has been a great success for us.
And I noticed that, I see it on the website for Fatherhood Network that you actually meet in 2 different locations on alternating meetings, right? What was some of the access considerations in putting that in place, right? What was the...
Yeah, well, again, kind of going to that cultural and trust piece. One, we wanted to be more accessible and go to where we knew fathers and families were at. And so utilizing community centers, but also this cultural and trust piece and just understanding that some parents and fathers just weren't comfortable meeting in certain locations. The big fancy building downtown, the community center on the other side of town, and that we needed to be more direct in going to where fathers and families were at.
Perfect. Thank you. Any other questions or things that you think people should ask themselves when thinking about access? Anything you want to add? Good.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, I'm repeating myself, but start with that getting away with if we build it, they will come, and really putting ourselves out there and going to parents and being uncomfortable with that, but also recognizing what we may come with. So is our institution trusted? What is the historical context of the institutions that we represent engaging families? Where's the meeting being held? Are parents and families able to get there? Is the meeting space physically accessible? Are we meeting on the 2nd or 3rd floor? Are there stairs? Thinking about some of those things. Accommodating individuals who maybe have language barriers. And so something like we're attempting to do on this webinar is something that we've also been keeping in mind. What are the language barriers, and do we need to be offering transportation when we're inviting parents to the table?
Perfect. Thank you so much. some of these other questions and advice that you're hearing from parents today are going to be sent to you via handout as well. But thank you, Jacob. It's so important to think about access. But I also want us to think about if are there instructions in place to make sure that everyone you bring on board is safe? You talked a little bit about that, Jacob, but Chandra, I want to turn it over to you to answer this question as we speak to our, this next leg of equitable interventions. So, Chandra, I know you and I have talked about this concept of safety and the importance of safety considerations when it comes to the actual setting of the table and parents being able to fully participate in decision-making and efforts. And you mentioned to me before that you've been invited to meetings where you show up to the table but end up feeling unsafe, or as you described, hostage in the space. Can you please tell us a little bit more about that and what safety considerations look like to you?
Sure. Thinking about safety to speak and being assured that what is shared has some level of confidence in the group, and also are there repercussions for speaking? How will it impact services? Could speaking up impact services in a negative and possibly covert way? And also a loss of benefits. When receiving reimbursement, can it affect any social service benefits, food, housing? And just for example, if a parent is receiving Social Security payments for a child with special needs, could attending the meeting and receiving $40 potentially cause $100 loss in income? I may want to serve or be a part, but is it going to cost me losing resources for my family?
Yeah, that's such an, that's so important, right? So like this idea that sometimes parents really want to help, but there's all these other considerations too. And this is such an important equity consideration. I know that, the other thing I've heard a lot is I know this people's unconscious biases around race, class, gender also play into the situations you are describing. And so it's important to think about our own accountability and checking your own biases, particularly when we might receive pushback from parents we're working with, or when a parent leader at the table challenges our current ways of operating, right? How will ensure that these biases and our egos, like they'll create a safe space for them, or make it so that we don't incorporate their feedback. And so, Chandra, I know you have talked about some like real practical ways that you've been able to, that you've seen, systems, bodies make safety considerations during meetings so that diverse populations that should be at the table felt safe and authentically collaborating, advising, and co-leading. Can you tell us a little bit more about like what some of those practices were, right?
Yeah, thinking about how is trust being built? And is everyone sharing their story or their why? Although parents had a lived experience, parents shouldn't be looked at as props, like, oh dear, poor you, or tokenize. And also create working agreements as a group, including an agreement that says to respect confidentiality, and everyone can be held accountable that things that parents discuss will not be used against them. And also asking if it is okay to share the experience with others, or do they feel comfortable for them sharing? Let's share those together about what you have experienced.
Thank you. I love how you talk about meeting agreements being used as a tool, right, to mediate that. Thank you for that. Anything that you'd like to add? Any other key questions that you think systems must consider when thinking about safety?
The location. For example, if it's at the intermediate school district, it could be triggering because of a negative or an emotional experience that happened in this location. And also use of acronyms. This can make parents feel like they're excluded because they don't know the language. And also preparation, how much time is involved, providing financial support, And with the financial support piece, the Social Security number that may have to go on the form. So when handling reimbursement, how many hands does this information have to go through, whether it's paper or electronically? And how many people have access to this sensitive information? And if I don't feel safe, can I really feel like a valuable member that can impact and have real systems change? These are all a part of the framework as it pertains to safety.
Okay, thank you. And so last but not least, the third leg of our stool is utility. And though I think many of us are often thinking about access, right? That's something that I have seen at the forefront of conversations about equity. And access is a little easier for us to identify. Utility, to me, is a huge factor in authentic collaboration, co-leadership, and truly embedding family leadership into your work. Because as Francisco explained, utility means that you have processes and infrastructures in place to ensure that you are accountable to accomplish the equitable intervention or the thing that you set out to do, right? So, for example, you wanted to have diverse voices of parents at the table, and you made sure diverse parents had access to the table and were safe enough to attend, right, through these things that Chandra describes. Now you have to think about the purpose of them being at the table. Groups need to know the purpose for working with parents. In essence, if you're bringing diverse voices to the table as part of your decision-making process and practice, then your group purpose is logically to change things. And utility is the conscious understanding that parents need to be at the core of that change. So their presence and your family leadership efforts have a purpose, right? And if they don't, then it's truly not equitable, because then their presence becomes simply a checking of the box. So Jacob, you have often talked about this, like about being in spaces where you felt tokenized. Can you explain what that means? And on the flip side, could you provide one example of where you have seen people stay engaged because there was no tokenism and everyone had equal voice and participatory weight?
Yeah, thanks, Natalia. Great question. Tokenism to me can be like a check the box action that initiatives take. So committees, institutions, boards, reaching out to get certain demographics of people to the table without really having done the work or being ready to fully accept these individuals for their authentic self. And so I've been in those positions, and it can be frustrating. And I'm sure other parent leaders on the call have as well. So I think it's important that when we look to kind of create with individuals, we're mindful of the language we use. And it's honestly kind of hard for me to think of examples where it was like this ideal setting and all voices were equal in the room. And I think that's why we're here doing this work. I will also say, in my experience as a parent leader showing up to boards and committees, it's been super helpful when initiatives are kind of clear and up front about power and authority in the room. Sometimes we as parent leaders, we come and we think we're going to make some change, and then it's like, it's not set up for that. But I think when initiatives can be real, like, hey, here's the power and authority that are at play, that's helpful. And so I think about my experience with Cradle Kalamazoo, a local initiative here in Kalamazoo that is kind of a cross-sector initiative looking to focus on equity around infant mortality that the Fatherhood Network is a part of. And so for me, that's a awesome initiative because it's also starting with the why of parent leaders. Oftentimes, parent leaders show up to initiatives with agendas, and we've got to push things through, which are great, and that's the reason we show up. But oftentimes, individuals can be lost in our why, and even just checking in. How are we doing? What is life like outside of this committee meeting? And so that's helpful when initiatives kind of lead with that.
Okay, thank you for that. So I heard you say that being centered at the tables that you're invited on, right? Being centered as a human, but also like really knowing the purpose and being explicit about that. So Chandra, same question to you I wanted to ask. where have you seen people stay engaged because there was utility in their process? Like what specifically happened or didn't happen that supported authentic engagement around utility and the purpose of your being?
It makes me think of our parent involvement committee, and that the utility was that parents were a part of developing the agendas, and we met before the big meeting, which was the state interagency coordinating council meeting. So parents led the parent involvement committee, and they co-led the interagency coordinating council meetings and suggested actions that were actually listened to and acted upon.
Okay. Thank you. So there was the purpose was met, right? So you're told the purpose and you listen. So that's utility. So I want to end our discussion of utility with bringing Francisco back here in talking about how a big part of utility is conscious, continuous reassessment. And that's continuous reassessment is actually one of the 5 core practices for embedding equity-focused family and parent leadership here at the National Center for Family and Parent Leadership. And that's because it ties in directly with this pillar of equity and equitable interventions. So Francisco, can you wrap this discussion up for us, telling us a little bit about how you were able to look at who was utilizing the county ID most, and then rethink strategies in your practices to ensure there was continuous change and improvement?
So to think about that lesson, I really have to then go back in time a little bit. As I mentioned earlier, my earlier work in Toronto, Canada, showed that implementation is just as important as passing a policy. So in the work that I've written, I describe how a grassroots organization got a policy passed, and the feeling in the community was that then the specific problem at hand would be fixed. Well, not so fast. As they say, the devil's in the details, and the implementation plan was not nearly as useful as had been expected. So I brought that lesson with me to Kalamazoo, and when the county ID was passed and the implementation plan was unfurled, we still wanted to ensure that the project stayed true to its spirit. So that meant that we kept reassessment front and center and continuously examined whether the card was as accessible, as safe, and as useful to the community. In one of the reports to the county, I used zip code data to map out exactly who was adopting the card, where they were located, and we found out that the vast majority lived close to the county clerk's office, where the ID was being issued. So we noticed that both location and timing could then be an issue. And we started looking to see what people around the country were doing. And we took note of Chicago. And by doing so, we then developed a mobile unit. Now we can schedule times when we come to different spaces in the community. And we go at different times of the day because not everyone is available during so-called office hours. I can't say that that entirely addressed accessibility, but it definitely enhanced it. And I am careful in that claim because I think the moment that you think that you have something completely figured out, you might have missed a huge set of barriers that you weren't even aware of. Thus, the need for constant reassessment. So in this way, I'm also proposing that these 3 legs are inextricably linked. And I also want us to think about, at least consider that they are not situated within a temporal continuum. That is, there shouldn't be this idea that one happens before another. This isn't about completing accessibility and then moving on to safety and then moving on to utility. They have to be addressed simultaneously for the intervention to prove valuable. And they must be reassessed on a continuous basis to make sure that we are indeed doing what we have proposed to do.
Yeah. Oh, what a great way to kind of close out the discussion, right? Like, are the practices I put in place doing what they were meant to do? Thank you. So what I'm really hearing is that big reason why utility and this continuous considerations is important in doing equitable family and parent leadership work is because it's also long-term. And in the context of embedding families as collaborators, co-leaders, advisors, and decision makers, you're constantly having to ask, right? Are we actually creating the conditions under which family and parent leadership is truly embedded in your decision making? Are we evaluating our process, access, and our safety needs to ensure our purpose is met? And, are parents an essential part of who's going to contribute towards change? And am I ready to make the change I brought them in to make? Because if not, then it's still not an effort towards equity, right? Even if you've thought about some of the other access or considerations. So thank you, all three of you. This has been a great discussion, and I know we're getting close to time. So with this, I really want to end our panel by circling back to a conversation Chandra and I had a few weeks ago, which she gave me permission to share a little bit here. And Chandra, this was such a great conversation that we had, where you provided this analogy around equity-focused family and parent leadership being like a really good ancestral family recipe. Would you mind sharing that analogy with us today to just end our conversation?
Sure. Well, there's key ingredients to any recipe. And so if I want to bake a cake for my grandmother, but it's her recipe, and I decide, I want it a little bit sweeter because, I like it real sweet. So I add a little bit more and I put some other ingredients in there and I present it to my grandmother. Here's the cake, and it doesn't work for her. And let's say she had an allergic reaction to the additional ingredient that I decided to add. So I need to have a conversation with my grandmother about her recipe, and she'll tell me why she used those ingredients. So I could make the cake and it looks good, but it tastes horrible or it caused other problems. And so then I realized I could not make the cake the way that I wanted it if I wanted the cake to be a success for my grandmother. So likewise, when working with families and communities, there are key ingredients, but families and communities know what the recipe is.
Thank you. So this work is only equitable if it's grounded in community. I love that metaphor. Made me hungry, but I love that we're ending with that. So thank you so much. To our panelists, I hope this short hour we spent together proved useful in getting you to think through a framework you can model, questions you need to ask, and practices you can put in place to authentically bring equity into your work. Now, because one of our panelists here today is a college professor, you are all walking away with a little bit of homework. So in the chat, there's a link to a handout with some resources from today that we wanted you all to have. Within that handout, there's a reflection exercise that Dr. Villegas so graciously developed for us. It's really important that when learning a new framework, we take the time to reflect on what we learned and how we can apply it to our work and our efforts. So when you leave today, we ask that you write down the equitable intervention you would like to propose or assess in your efforts to embed family and parent leadership into the part of the system where you work, and then identify the populations that you consider necessary to bring to advise, collaborate, and co-lead your intervention. And then thinking about the framework you learned today, what are the accessibility, safety, and utility considerations you need to make? And who can help you? What's the community that can help you identify that? What are your communities and your networks that can inform what accessibility needs, safety protocols, and purpose need to be put in place? More directions on the purpose of the exercise can be found in this handout. I would love to hear from you what you come up with and what questions you might have once and after you get a chance to reflect on today's webinar and complete that worksheet. So thank you so much. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jerry Cobb to close us out. And then we'll stay on for another couple minutes to take one or two questions, but we'll follow up with you after today.
Thanks, Natalia. What a fantastic hour you've just been through. There's just so much food for thought that was shared with the presenters, and just want to thank you all so much for giving us your time, and to all of you in the audience for taking the time to participate as well and to really prioritize this important work. Before we close out, I want to encourage all of you, if you have not already joined the National Collaborative for Infants and Toddlers and the Prenatal-to-Three Exchange. It's a great platform to exchange information, to ask questions, to connect with experts, to get the latest resources. They're putting the link in the chat, so definitely sign up if you haven't already. And finally, we know that feedback is a gift we can all give. So if you could just take one more minute and fill out the live poll so we can continue to learn what content is resonating with our audience as we build out future webinars. And finally, we had hoped to do translation for this webinar. It did not work out. There were some technical problems, but we're going to keep working at this because we know that's important as well. Have a number of partners who are really working hard to build community, and that begins with making sure everybody can be a full participant in the conversation. So we will do better next time, and appreciate your patience. And I will turn it back to Natalia in case there are other questions.
Thank you. And thank you all so much. There's one question from the audience that I think we have a little bit of time to answer here today. So Jacob and Chandra, I'm going to turn this to you. The question is, where are some places that you met to reach fathers and parents? So basically, like, where do you reach them for these efforts and build those networks that y'all talked about? Jacob, do you want to?
Yeah. So I'll jump in here. You know, as a parent leader, I drop and as a parent, right? As a father, I drop my kids off to school. And you'd be surprised at how many parents, and fathers specifically, I see dropping their kids off or picking their kids up. So recruiting those parents and letting them know about the Fatherhood Network, the initiative, our dad cafes, and opportunities is one. Also, like I mentioned, most every community has a maternal and child health unit somewhere. And I would almost bet money that a lot of those maternal and child health units are engaging mothers who have partners or fathers. And so using maternal and child health units to kind of partner with home visiting programs that are, you know, meeting and supporting mom is a great way.
Yeah. Anything to add, Chandra?
In the community, what programs and services that I'm using, and always being on the lookout for other parents that may want to be involved. And as a parent leader, it's about bringing other people along. So looking for others who want to be involved and engage and have leadership opportunities.
Yeah. So community organizations is a great, but remember, communities are made up of parents. So make a list. What are the community organizations in your area? And then reach out, right? See if you can come to some of the events and programs as well. Thank you. Okay, we can do one last question. And Chandra, I think I'm going to start with you on that one because that'll be good. So one of the questions came in, said, I can tell you have a holistic approach to ensure the parents are accessible and all-inclusive. In thinking of safety, how do you engage a room when there are bias while ensuring our voices are heard? It's a tough question, but I think
acknowledge it.
Yeah.
Or acknowledge it. And it oftentimes parents receive training, but there should be training on both ends to address biases. Parent and professional, in order to have that partnership, it's not just parents having training, but professionals being trained and calling things out, that these are some things that are noticed and what are intentional ways to address those biases.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. That's great advice. I appreciate y'all being here. And yeah, thank you for your time. And we're going to collect some of these questions that you put on the chat, and we're going to send out an FAQ as a follow-up as well. And you can always, reach out to us at the Early Childhood Investment Corporation if you have questions or anything that you'd like to discuss. We'd be happy to talk to you. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.